Sophia woke up one day, not in her bed, but in a place she didn't recognize. The sheets were soft, far too luxurious for her. As she sat up in confusion, a handsome man stood nearby, watching her as if he'd been waiting for her to wake. Startled, Sophia asked who he was. The man's name is Claude, captain of the First Order of the Crown Prince. But instead of answering her questions, Claude scoffed, assuming she was pulling another one of her tricks. He ignored her confusion completely, saying that after years of enduring her as the leading fiancé candidate, he was already used to her antics. After the scandal she'd caused, humiliating the Crown Prince himself, Claude had been assigned to guard her personally. The Archduke had even placed a special seal over the tower where she was now confined. No matter what tricks that woman pull, there's no escaping for her, Claude said sharply before leaving the room. That name, Violet, made Sophia freeze. She had no idea what was happening, but she recognized that name. Violet was the most despicable villainess in the entire kingdom. At first, Sophia thought Claude must have mistaken her for that horrible woman. But when she caught sight of herself in the mirror, the truth hit her like a blow. She wasn't in her own body anymore. Her full actual name is Sophia Alcott, the eldest daughter of a noble family, had always been branded as the shame of the Alcotts. Rumors painted her as an eccentric recluse obsessed with poisons and secret concoctions. She'd never been introduced to society, even at 16, because her stepmother and stepsister forbade it. In truth, Sophia only spent her time making potions because her late mother, a genius apothecary, had passed away when Sophia was 3. When her stepmother arrived, already pregnant, Sophia slowly became unwanted, especially after her half-sister was born. Left alone, she devoted herself to her mother's old notes, learning how to craft potions and medicines. Her quiet, lonely life didn't bother her much until now, when she found herself trapped in the body of the kingdom's most wicked villain. When she tried speaking to the maids, they turned pale with fear, apologizing frantically. Just how terrifying had the real Violet been? Still not used to the situation, Sophia felt uncomfortable using the lavish bed and decided to sleep on the floor instead. When Claude came by to deliver her meal, he stopped short, bewildered to see her lying there. He asked what on earth she was doing, thinking she was being dramatic again. Since Violet had once claimed she'd rather sleep on the floor than in her prison bed. But Sophia stammered nervously, admitting that the bed was simply too soft for her. She explained she usually slept in a storage room surrounded by her herbs and potions. Trying to sound earnest, she even promised to clean the floor afterward. Claude sighed heavily, clearly out of patience, while Sophia was acting completely out of character. But she didn't notice. Her eyes sparkled as she caught sight of the food tray. Ignoring Claude's cold warning that her contact with the servants could be cut off, she blurted out a question. Was all this food really for her? Claude raised an eyebrow. He knew the meal was modest compared to what Violet was used to, but Sophia's face lit up. To her, it looked like a feast. When she tried to store the leftovers in a cabinet for later, Claude scolded her. Sophia quickly explained that she wanted to save the food for tomorrow. She thought she'd only be fed once a day, like in her old life. Claude groaned, rubbing his temples in disbelief. Fighting to stay calm, he explained again the prison's rules. She would receive 3 full meals a day and 2 snacks. Hot baths were allowed every 3 days. Jewelry was restricted to a single bracelet. If she wanted books or writing supplies, she'd need his approval. And starting that very day, a priest would visit her daily to teach her proper etiquette, so she could stop behaving like a barbarian. Hearing all that, Sophia's jaw dropped. The life of a prisoner here sounded more luxurious than anything she'd ever known. Claude, who had been barely keeping his temper in check, finally snapped. He demanded to know what kind of act she was pulling this time. Normally, Violet would insult the servants non-stop, throw tantrums if she wasn't served gourmet meals, and mock him to his face every chance she got. The real Violet, he said bitterly, would never be satisfied with anything less than perfection. That was when it hit Sophia. Everything he just said perfectly described a villain. Claude sighed heavily, exhausted. He told her to stop pretending and just eat properly for once before storming off. Sophia glanced at her reflection in the water inside her cup. The woman staring back at her was dazzling. Violet was famous for 2 things, her unmatched beauty and her rotten heart. the evil lady everyone despised. Even Sophia, who had rarely left the dusty basement of her family's mansion, had heard tales of Violet's arrogance, selfishness, and cruel indulgence. She was as vicious as she was stunning. But why had Violet been imprisoned in this place called the Spire of Confinement? What exactly had she done to her royal fiancé? As Sophia ate, her mind raced. Could it be that Violet had somehow switched their souls? Maybe this was her way of escaping? But how could she have done that? Did Violet possess magic powerful enough to trade bodies? And most importantly, why choose her? For a brief moment, Sophia considered telling Claude the truth. But no, he'd never believe such a thing. Besides, this prison felt like paradise compared to her old life. So she decided to keep quiet and simply enjoy this strange new existence, keeping the secret of their soul swap to herself. Meanwhile, in his office, Claude was losing his mind. He couldn't make sense of Violet's sudden change. What kind of new scheme was she planning? A knock came at the door. His vice captain, Neil, stepped in, asking if Violet had caused any trouble yet, or if she'd already cursed Claude out. Chuckling, Neil joked that maybe she'd finally repented, since her behavior lately had been oddly mild. Claude's expression darkened as memories flooded back. The moment Violet had slapped the crown prince and thrown a tantrum in front of everyone, that was when her punishment began. She had drenched Prince Johannes in wine, then forced his fiancée, Lady Lily, to kneel before her, all during the royal engagement ceremony. Violet's reputation had always been terrible, but that incident had crossed every line imaginable. What baffled Claude most was why. Violet had barely spoken to Lily before that day, so what had driven her to such fury? No matter how many times he questioned her afterward, Violet refused to explain. Claude tried not to think about it too much. His duty was to discipline her, nothing more. Neil, of course, couldn't resist teasing him, calling it strange for a fiancé to speak that harshly. Claude snapped back that he was just a candidate and had no intention of marrying Violet. Still, something about the situation gnawed at him. The king clearly doted on Violet, his niece, more than on his own son, the crown prince. It was the king's idea to confine her here, hoping the punishment would finally tame her wild nature. Both Claude and Violet had long used their status as royal betrothal candidates to avoid being tied down to other noble families. But now that Violet's behavior had reached this point, everything might change. Neil interrupted Claude's thoughts, reminding him of something strange. Before Violet was locked in the tower, she had suddenly collapsed in the snow. The doctor claimed it was only stress-induced fainting. Trying to reassure his captain, Neil added that Violet was still only 18. Perhaps this punishment had finally shocked her into changing her ways, but Claude didn't believe a word of it. He remembered vividly how Violet had stood before the tower, tall, proud, and utterly defiant. What sent a chill down his spine was the way she'd glanced back at him with that smug, taunting smile, as if she were pleased with herself. For her to suddenly wake up acting like a different person? Impossible. Claude's expression hardened. He warned Neil in a clipped voice not to let their guard down. He knew Violet too well. She wasn't the kind of woman who feared consequences, and she was capable of doing the most unpredictable things imaginable. Meanwhile, back in the tower, Sophia noticed something strange about the bracelet on her wrist. It pressed oddly against her skin, like something was hidden inside. Curious, she fiddled with it until she found a small compartment tucked within the band. Inside was a folded piece of paper. When she carefully opened it, a single word was written in elegant scarlet ink. Beneath it, a message in Violet's refined handwriting declared that the bearer of the bracelet was granted great privilege, and warned that even a single scratch on her body would bring dire consequences. And as for the real Violet, she awoke far away in the cold, dim basement of the Alcott estate. The air was thick with the stench of herbs and dust. Books were piled haphazardly around her, and the scratchy blanket clinging to her skin smelled awful. Violet grimaced, yanking it off in disgust. This was Sophia's life? She rolled her eyes in fury. Never in her wildest imagination had she expected that the body she'd traded for would belong to such a miserable little wretch. She had switched bodies with a stray mongrel. The more Violet looked around the basement, the more irritated she became. She couldn't believe a human strong enough to fight was actually living down here. And that dress, thin as paper in the middle of winter, hanging loose in all the wrong places, was an insult to her taste. The shelves filled with crude potions made it obvious. The real Sophia had been studying apothecary on her own. Violet smirked. Just as she'd suspected, Sophia was freakish arbuthnot. Whatever that meant, we don't know the mystery yet. Still, she wondered if the Sophia, now trapped in her body, could adapt to her luxurious life. And more than that, she was certain Claude wouldn't realize right away that the Violet in front of him wasn't real. The thought of his dumbfounded face later almost made her laugh. But that could wait. Right now, she needed a bath and a proper meal, maybe even a new room, and some decent self-care for heaven's sake. She was just about to leave when the door creaked open and a maid stood there, startled. Her name was Maria, bringing food for Sophia, but she froze when she saw Violet standing. Usually, Sophia never left the basement without her stepmother's permission. Then, Violet caught sight of what the maid was holding, a single piece of burnt bread. Her expression darkened instantly. A noble like her served with filth like that? Outrageous. She demanded to know if Maria really expected her to eat it, then coldly offered to return the favor by making Maria eat it instead. If Maria couldn't bring herself to swallow that garbage, how dare she think Sophia should? Her eyes narrowed, dripping with contempt, her presence suffocating the air. Maria trembled, speechless, paralyzed under that cruel gaze. Violet wasn't finished. She declared she wouldn't eat now, and ordered Maria to prepare a bath immediately, demanding an answer. The terrified maid bowed her head and obeyed without protest, heart pounding as she wondered who this girl really was. This presence felt nothing like Sophia. That chilling aura of authority spread fast. Servants all over the mansion scrambled to obey her without question. It wasn't long before word reached Isabella, Sophia's stepmother, and her stepsister Julia. Enraged, the two stormed down to confront her. Isabella demanded to know how she dared act on her own without permission. Julia, fuming even more, pointed out that the dress Violet wore was hers. Violet scoffed. She apologized sarcastically and coldly for not having any clothes to wear. Though frankly, she thinks the style's outdated and the fabric's cheap. Isabella blinked in shock, taken aback by the sudden boldness, but she recovered quickly, snapping that Sophia had no power in this house. Violet's gaze drifted lazily toward Julia's hand, where a small ring glinted. Then she stood. Her tone shifted, sharp, cutting. She accused them outright. The rumors about Sophia abusing servants, bossing around her stepmother and stepsister, and squandering her father's wealth. Those stories had come from them. Both women froze, caught off guard. Violet laughed, eyes glinting with malice. "Then she'll make those rumors true," she whispered it. The color drained from Isabella and Julia's faces. She called for the head butler and, to their disbelief, ordered him to escort the two women to their new residence. And he obeyed, without question. Violet's laughter echoed through the room. Quoting scripture, she mocked them. "Thou shalt not bear false witness," twisting their own pious words into a weapon. So much for their Holy Family image. As her plan began to unfold, Violet decided she might as well spend a little time improving the life of the poor girl whose body she'd borrowed. Smiling to herself, she thought Sophia ought to thank her someday. Meanwhile, inside Violet's body, Sophia greeted Claude that morning with a radiant smile. She was thrilled to see him, not because of Claude himself, but because of the food he was carrying. Claude could tell, of course, and teased her for her awkward, over-the-top act. Sophia had tried her best to behave like Violet after reading the tiny note tied around her bracelet, but she couldn't fool her own heart for long. Eventually, she dropped the act and confessed everything to Claude. Just as she expected, he didn't believe a word of it. That morning, however, Claude wasn't alone. Standing behind him was Neil, curious to see how much the infamous Villainess had supposedly changed. He introduced himself politely, and Sophia responded with a graceful bow. Without wasting time, Neil proposed they share a meal together, calling it a small gesture of friendship. Claude, inwardly skeptical, doubted it would go smoothly. But to his surprise, Sophia, who hadn't eaten with anyone for over 12 years, lit up with joy and accepted the offer right away. Then came the shock. Instead of calling a maid, Sophia prepared the table herself. She bustled around arranging dishes, almost forgetting she was supposed to be acting as Violet. When Claude asked why, she simply said the room was hers, so it was her duty to care for her guests. Then she began decorating the table with flowers. Neil stared in disbelief. The change was unnerving. Violet seemed like an entirely different person, As he glanced around, he noticed something else strange. The room was filled with plants, pots, and jars of all shapes and sizes. Claude leaned closer, whispering that Violet herself had requested the setup, though he admitted he had no idea what she was planning. Before Neil could respond, Sophia called them to sit down. The table looked lovely, the food neatly arranged, the atmosphere almost warm. To Claude's surprise, Sophia and Neil conversed easily throughout the meal, laughing and trading thoughts. Claude stayed quiet, yet for once he didn't mind watching her. Sophia, glowing with happiness, was simply enjoying herself. Something she hadn't done in years, completely unaware that Claude's gaze had turned into curiosity. After they finished eating, Neil brewed tea for the three of them. The moment Sophia took a sip, she identified it instantly: horsetail tea. Her accuracy startled both men. Neil explained that in his homeland, the Donovan region, the soil was dry and difficult to farm, but horsetail plants grew abundantly. People there brewed tea from them out of necessity. Then his voice dimmed. A strange illness had been spreading through the area, causing loss of appetite, exhaustion, numbness in the hands and feet, and eventually paralysis. The oddest part was that only young people were affected. Sophia's eyes widened. She recognized the symptoms immediately. Gently, she asked if those youths ate white bread along with their horsetail tea. Then she explained. The white bread served in the tower now was different from the dark bread commoners used to eat. It didn't mix well with horsetail. If eaten together without a balanced diet, it could lead to sickness. She suggested adding black bread to their meals, or even millet-based dishes, to prevent further harm. She mentioned she'd once read that such illnesses originated in the East, caused by dietary imbalance. Claude listened in stunned silence. Sophia continued, noting how white bread had recently become fashionable among commoners, especially the younger ones, which could explain why they were more vulnerable. Neil took her words seriously, promising to bring the matter to the local doctor. Sophia's face brightened at that. She added that horsetail itself was an incredible plant, useful for treating wounds and coughs, but reminded them that every medicine could become poison if misused. Her tone turned passionate, her eyes gleaming with genuine fascination. Claude couldn't look away. The woman before him, this so-called Violet, spoke with knowledge and warmth he'd never seen before. Suspicion stirred quietly in his mind, but Claude quickly took back his suspicion. He suddenly remembered. One of Violet's former tutors had come from an apothecary family too. That alone could explain her sudden expertise. Sophia, realizing she had spoken too naturally, could only laugh it off when Neil complimented her, saying she sounded like a real apothecary. Inside, she winced, because she was one, and silently scolded herself not to slip up again. Before leaving the room, Neil, ever polite, asked if Violet wanted to eat again the soup they'd just eaten, since she seemed to enjoy it so much, or if there was any particular food she'd like next time. Sophia hesitated, cheeks slightly flushed, then shyly asked if she could have honey next time. Her eyes sparkled at the thought of its sweetness. Claude froze, his eyes widened in disbelief, a chill running down his spine. Sophia noticed and quickly added that honey was expensive. She didn't want to trouble them for something so rare, but Neil stayed silent, equally stunned. On their way back, Neil finally broke the silence. In a low voice, he said he didn't think that woman was Violet. Claude immediately snapped back, insisting she was. But Neil reminded him, when Prince Johannes once visited Violet while she was sick and brought her honey, she had thrown it to the floor in disgust. That day, Neil had accompanied Claude specifically to judge the change for himself, and he was certain. The person they'd just met felt like someone else entirely. He even asked Claude whether they should consider Violet's strange claim that she had swapped bodies as truth. Claude refused flatly. He'd already consulted the palace's mage, who confirmed that kind of magic didn't exist and was impossible to perform. Neil decided not to argue further, shifting the topic instead. He asked if there was any word from the Archduke, the king's older brother, and a legendary mage once hailed as the hero who saved the kingdom. He was the one who had sealed the magic in the tower, and had been Violet's own magic instructor, but for reasons unknown, he had cut off all contact with her, saying he could no longer tolerate her behavior. Claude suspected there was more to the story, but he kept those thoughts to himself. A quick look back to the past. Claude first met Violet at a tea party. By then, Violet already knew a bit about him. Her cousin Johannes often boasted about his brilliant aide, the Royal Guard commander's prized apprentice. Claude's father wasn't much better. He'd brag endlessly about his son until Claude wanted to disappear from embarrassment. When they finally had a chance to share tea together, Violet bluntly asked whether Claude planned to keep serving her cousin, that empty-headed prince. In her eyes, if he did, he'd die like a dog in the end. But what caught Violet off guard, and even made her chuckle a little, was that Claude didn't argue or defend Johannes. He just stayed silent, meeting her gaze without flinching. To Violet, that quiet composure was almost boring. Claude, on the other hand, thought she was unbearably arrogant. He had no interest in humoring her. But the king misunderstood their interaction and suddenly named Claude as one of Violet's leading fiancé candidates. From then on, their paths kept crossing. Serving as Violet's escort, Claude saw firsthand how merciless she could be. Even the smallest slight was enough to ignite her wrath. Once, when a noble accidentally stepped on her dress, she ruined their entire family overnight. Claude, unable to comprehend such cruelty, confronted her. Why go that far over something so trivial? Violet had met his gaze, calm but razor sharp, and told him, if she don't pay back every insult twice over, one day they'll drag her down into the dirt. Those words, and the cold fire in her eyes, stayed with him ever since. Now, years later, in the tower where she was imprisoned, that memory haunted him. Claude knew Violet had lost her mother when she was only 5. He'd always thought her disdain for flowers came from that loss. Maybe they reminded her too much of what she'd buried. But lately, something felt different. When Claude entered Sophia's chamber with breakfast, a simple toast drizzled with honey, her face lit up in pure delight. She looked genuinely thankful, but her joyful expression made Claude uneasy, almost creeped out, so he told her to stop pretending. Yet Sophia's response was sincere. She said she hadn't expected anyone to take the time to prepare something for someone like her. Her words, soft and honest, left Claude speechless. He couldn't believe it when she actually tasted the honey, something Violet had always despised. But she did, smiling brightly as she savored the sweetness. For a moment, Claude just stared, shaken by the sight. He told her to eat slowly so she wouldn't choke, then sat down nearby. Sophia apologized and took smaller bites, smiling through every one. It had been so long since she'd tasted honey. The last time was when her mother was still alive. Back then, she'd be fed a spoonful while her mother told her honey was food for the mind, something that helped her think clearly. Her mother would gently touch her cheek and remind her, no matter how hard life gets, there will always be small things that can make you happy. Remembering that, Sophia couldn't hold back her tears. They fell before she even realized it, startling Claude. She hadn't expected to cry either. She tried to laugh it off, saying she was just happy to eat something sweet again, but her trembling voice gave her away. She admitted she suddenly remembered her mother, and she didn't understand why, now of all times. Back at the funeral, she couldn't shed a single tear. Claude said nothing. He quietly left the room, saying only that he'd see her again at lunch. But once he was behind the door, he stopped and stood there for a long while. He never imagined that the proud, untouchable Violet could cry out of longing for her mother. And for the first time, Claude wondered, had he ever truly known her at all? After a while, Sophia had calmed down again, embarrassed that she'd cried over something so small. But somehow, her heart felt lighter, her mind clearer. With renewed focus, she returned to her work, drafting a new potion prototype. Muttering calculations under her breath, she estimated its failure rate, material compatibility, and overall efficiency. Her expression grew serious. If this worked, it could help countless people living in infertile regions. So absorbed in her thoughts, she didn't even notice when Claude arrived with lunch. His voice startled her, and she spun around, surprised at how much time had passed. When he asked what she was working on, Sophia hesitated, before shyly explaining that she was developing an airtight, edible container. Ever since hearing Neil's story the other day, she'd been thinking about how to help. The issue wasn't just food shortages, it was the lack of balanced nutrition. The barren land offered no variety, and without diversity in their diet, people would eventually fall ill, so she wanted to find another way. Realizing the conversation could take a while, Claude suggested they talk while eating. Lunch was beef braised in red wine. He mentioned that Violet might like it, because it was made with her favorite wine. Sophia accidentally reacted to that bit of information as if it were new, then quickly corrected herself, realizing Claude was watching her with suspicion. She hurriedly shifted the topic back to her project. Her idea, she explained, was to create edible containers made from medicinal herbs, safe to swallow and rich in nutrients. By boiling and drying 2 specific extracts, she could mold them into pill-like forms that preserved food value. Her goal was to solve multiple issues at once: distribution, preservation, and easy consumption. Looking up with a spark of determination, Sophia said she truly believed this could make a difference in the future. The main ingredient, she added, came from wild plants growing near the capital, cheap and easy to obtain. If so, even the poor in Donovan's land could afford it. Then, realizing she might have sounded overly eager, Sophia apologized for getting carried away. Claude shook his head. He told her if the pill really worked, it could change lives, but the challenge would be scale. There were countless impoverished regions across the kingdom. To supply them all, they'd need farmers willing to dedicate their fields to cultivating those plants and facilities to produce the pills in bulk. Still, he admitted, it was a groundbreaking concept. On the battlefield, soldiers had long dreamed of something like that. A compact, nutritious food source. Investors would be drawn to it too. And given how famine had haunted the nation in recent years, Claude believed the royal court would take great interest. After a pause, Claude added, without looking directly at her, that he had always thought of Violet as villainous, without equal. The comment made Sophia blink in confusion. He gave a faint shrug. The Violet he knew always seemed to enjoy her reputation, whether people called her good or evil. Then, meeting Sophia's gaze, his expression softened. For the first time, he admitted that Violet truly amazed him. Even there's selfish motives behind. This idea deserved praise. He respected her for it, and offered a small, genuine smile. Sophia blushed, flustered, but secretly proud, even if the compliment wasn't really meant for her. To break the awkward silence, Claude cleared his throat and changed the topic. There was a schedule change. Prince Johannes would be visiting that afternoon, accompanied by his fiancée, Lily. Claude warned Violet to behave. No slapping, no bowing mockingly, no provocation of any kind. If she dared cause a scene, her punishment would go far beyond imprisonment. As soon as the Crown Prince and Lady Lily entered the room, the air turned tense. Sophia straightened up and greeted them as politely as she could. Johannes, however, looked at her with suspicion. He said Claude's report was right. Violet did seem to have become a lot tamer. To everyone's surprise, Lily gently asked her fiancé not to be too harsh on his cousin. At her words, Johannes softened immediately and obeyed without question. Sophia recalled what her stepsister once said about Lady Lily, that she was like a white flower, beautiful and gentle. Strangely enough, Sophia caught a faint scent of that same flower in the air. Even so, Johannes, hopelessly in love with his fiancée, still couldn't bring himself to trust Violet. The Violet he knew was never one to apologize sincerely, and now, all of a sudden, she was pretending to be some sort of apothecary after her imprisonment. Without warning, Johannes stepped forward, grabbing Sophia's arm roughly. His grip was tight, his eyes sharp, as he demanded, almost rudely, to know what Violet was plotting this time. Caught off guard, Sophia couldn't even answer. All she noticed was the strong scent of lilies clinging to the Crown Prince. Before things could escalate, Claude intervened, calmly reminding Johannes that any violent behavior toward prisoners in the tower was forbidden. He carefully urged the prince to compose himself. Johannes clicked his tongue in irritation, but eventually backed down, saying they had only come to confirm Claude's report about Violet and would be leaving soon. Uneasy, Sophia spoke up, asking Johannes to wait a moment. The prince turned around, assuming she was finally going to apologize sincerely. Instead, Sophia swallowed hard and said that his hand felt strangely cold earlier. Then, she asked if he'd been having health issues lately. Her words hit the mark. Johannes looked genuinely startled. Sophia continued, saying that his body temperature wasn't normal for a human, that his eyes were unnaturally red and his complexion pale. She went on to ask if he'd been having trouble sleeping, losing his appetite, or experiencing mood swings. That was the last straw. Johannes cut her off with a furious shout, accusing Violet of pretending to be an apothecary. He said the royal apothecaries were already monitoring his condition closely, and he didn't need some meddling woman acting concerned. Slamming his fist against the wall, he ordered Violet to stay away from him and finally left. Sophia stood in silence for a moment, then turned to Claude and asked if she could offer the prince a glass of milk. She wanted to add a small amount of herbs that would help him sleep better. To prove her good intentions, she even offered to let Claude watch her mix it, so he could be sure she wasn't trying to poison the prince. There was such genuine earnestness in her eyes that Claude eventually agreed, though he insisted he would be the one to deliver it, not her. Even later, during her ethics lesson with Priest Maurice, Sophia found herself distracted, still worrying about Johannes's condition. When Maurice noticed and scolded her for not paying attention, she apologized automatically. But instead of being angry, the priest began to cry. To him, it was unthinkable that the noble Lady Violet would lower herself to listen to someone as insignificant as him. He said it must have been unbearable living in the tower like this. The ethics sermons, it turned out, were personally arranged by the Archduke. Sophia thought it odd. Even after being cut off, Violet was still being guided like this. Before, Maurice admitted he never expected to meet Violet again, and seeing her so lost and confused seemed to shake him. But that moment passed quickly. He began praising Violet with fervent devotion, his words overflowing with admiration. Sophia had the unsettling thought that if she told him she wasn't the real Violet, Maurice would believe her instantly. The priest even confessed that both he and the Archduke secretly believed Violet, not Johannes, was the one truly fit to be the next monarch. With a sorrowful tone, he said Archduke had cut ties for her sake, but because the time to reveal the truth had not yet come, they need to be patient. When he realized he had spoken too freely, Maurice fell to his knees in a dramatic apology. Meanwhile, at Count Alcott's manor, Malcolm, Sophia's father, had just returned from a business trip. He was immediately greeted by Julia, who complained tearfully about Violet's outrageous behavior and claimed she had gone insane. The maids backed her story, saying Lady Sophia had even dared to claim a bedroom for herself. Malcolm assumed his daughter had simply reached her limit with unfair treatment. He ordered the head butler, George, to put a stop to any unjust behavior and make sure Sophia had better living conditions than before. He thought giving her a decent room instead of the basement would calm her down, but George, looking uneasy, admitted that Lady Sophia had already gone too far. She was treating Isabella like a servant, saying it was to teach her some humility. To make matters worse, George handed Malcolm a thick stack of papers, bills for all the dresses and jewelry Violet had been purchasing lately. Violet couldn't care less. She had been waiting for Malcolm to storm into her room in a fit of rage, and right on cue, the door burst open. He came in like a madman, waving a stack of bills in his hand. Violet smirked at his lack of composure, mocking him for behaving nothing like a gentleman. Malcolm didn't bother to hide his fury. He declared that as punishment, Sophia would be married off as a wealthy man's second wife to pay for all those expenses. That ridiculous threat made Violet laugh out loud, the kind of laugh that cuts deep. It was the most pathetic and laughable thing she had ever heard. Her laughter sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. He faltered, suddenly unsure, as Violet's aura grew darker. She told him she'd been waiting for his return, because she had some pleasant information to share. The ominous way she said it froze the room. Pretending to think it over for a moment, Violet finally grinned with malicious delight. Her first piece of news: Sophia Alcott is a descendant of the noble Arbuthnot family. She made sure to emphasize the scandal, that Malcolm had impregnated Isabella out of wedlock, a grave sin, and that Julia, therefore, wasn't a legitimate heir. But Violet guessed Malcolm wasn't worried. Men like him always assumed the church could be bought into silence. Fixing her sharp gaze on him, Violet went on. Sophia wasn't as ignorant as everyone thought, and she wasn't going to keep playing the helpless fool anymore. She declared with pride that the blood of the Arbuthnot family gave her the authority to command, with a mere wave of her hand. If Malcolm didn't believe her, he could ask Isabella. A few days ago, a priest named Maurice had come to offer Sophia a blessing, a high-ranking cleric from the cathedral, and a man deeply connected to the Arbuthnot family. In truth, Violet had planned this long before their body swap. Maurice was an irritating man, but occasionally useful. Realizing his sins were exposed, Malcolm sank to the floor, pale and shaken. Violet flicked her hair with disdain. Considering he had taken a lady of the Arbuthnot line as his wife, he should have known what that meant. Every medicine produced by the Arbuthnot lineage was under strict royal authority, Every potion Sophia had made over the years came from her late mother's notes. She'd been deceived into thinking those medicines were for local trade, an idea planted by the maid Maria, but actually masterminded by Isabella. Violet knew Sophia, in her innocence, had worked tirelessly, accepting a pitiful payment and reinvesting it all into herbs and tools. The thought made Violet furious. All that hard work, wasted. Truly an Arbuthnot, brilliant, but hopelessly obsessed with medicine. Without even looking at Malcolm, Violet went on coldly, asking what would happen if the king learned about all this, the Alcott family's crimes and injustice. Malcolm slumped in defeat, admitting her accusations were true. Still, he insisted her extravagance and the mountain of bills were excessive, a cruel form of revenge. Violet scoffed. A few dresses and handkerchiefs, that wasn't nearly enough to settle a debt 13 years old. Revenge, she said, wasn't even hers to deliver. Malcolm grew restless, asking what she meant. If he was the one expected to take responsibility. Violet burst into laughter. The old man wasn't even in a position to move freely, much less dictate anything. Watching him squirm, Violet knew he wanted to claim ignorance, to say he'd merely been a bystander. But she wasn't buying it. She already knew Isabella and Julia had sent him letters, full of complaints. There was no way he didn't know what was happening in his own house. He was the perfect image of a useless head of family. Then, with a sly smile, Violet changed the subject. Her second announcement? She would be making her official debut in society in just 2.5 months. A bold, last-minute move, especially since Sophia had been hidden away her whole life. It would be expensive, extravagant, and utterly scandalous. Running her fingers through her borrowed hair, Violet added with a mischievous gleam in her eye that she planned to host a grand, luxurious party, and among the honored guests she would invite none other than Lady Violet Elford, meaning the real Sophia, now living in her original body.